Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the September meeting of the Houston Archaeological Society. My name is Bob Sewell, and I'm the president of the society. And I'm pleased to present to you Dr. Gus Costa, who's going to talk to us about fingerprinting and sourcing of ancient Texas copper. Gus is an HAS member, long-time HAS member, and an independent archaeological consultant. He's also worked with HAS in liaison with Rice University, revitalizing some of the collections that the university has. And he's also been more recently working at the Nighthawk Bison Jump project. But this evening, he's going to talk about sourcing of ancient Texas copper. If you, Gus Costa.
Yeah, thanks for allowing me to talk about something that's not bison, because that's been kind of ruling my life. What's that? Okay, you can hear me all right? Yeah, it's been ruling my life for a couple of years now, and this is a project that I've had going for like 6 years, and it's just drug on and on and on. So I wanted to prepare something to try to get some of our results out. It's still very preliminary, but I wanted to try to push this project forward a little more by creating a presentation for it. So yeah, we're going to talk about some of the work that I've been doing zapping copper artifacts from Texas. So here's the problem that I'm trying to address with this research is, first, we have these weird copper artifacts, not weird in terms of like they're shaped weird, maybe some of them are, but they're rare. And when we find them, we go, oh, that's weird, because there's no serviceable copper in Texas. There's copper in the Llano Uplift area, but that's very low-grade ore. You'd have to put in some serious industrial level processing to be able to get any copper out of those rocks. So for a long time, when we found these copper artifacts, we assumed that they came from a long way away, generally the upper Michigan Peninsula area where there's a lot of natural copper. However, we literally have no direct data until now. And so the solution that I've proposed is to use lasers to sample these artifacts and do a provenance study with ICP-MS. And I'll explain what that weird acronym is about 15 slides from now. Just keep you wondering. So what are provenance studies? Provenance studies in archaeology is the determination of the source of artifact materials. And I kind of view it as a subset of geoarchaeology. It's something that I've had a long interest in. And it has a long history in archaeology, almost 150 plus years. The bluestones from Stonehenge were examined photographically. They were all the way back in the 19th century. Another example of qualitative provenance studies would be looking at the different types of might be dirt, this particular type of fossil, or even just comparing rocks. Like when we see Georgetown chert or flint in Texas, we know it because it has this characteristic qualitative look to it compared to other types of rock. Once you got into the 1960s, you had this revolution of spectroscopy, which is, the physical study of the composition of matter through various ways. And so that allowed us to actually characterize different raw materials, look at the bulk element composition and the trace element composition. So we could develop these fingerprints for different types of raw materials and then match them to known sources. But this isn't magic, okay? There's a lot of problems with this technique, and it's probabilistic. And the reason that I put this here is recently, like it was published in August, they discovered that this altar stone in the middle of Stonehenge actually didn't come from where they thought it came from for hundreds of years. It actually came from possibly as far away as the Orkneys. So everything is in transition. It's just like everything else in science, right? We're getting closer and closer to the actual answer. And this holds really true for provenance research. So there's a couple of important assumptions about provenance research. We often call it the provenance postulate. Is the difference between different sources has to exceed the variation within each source. This is one of the problems that we have in Texas, because there's a lot of variation within Edward Church. And so it's hard to differentiate where it came from. It's also spread out over a large area of the landscape. So you have to be able to separate the variability from one location from others. And the other thing is that the methods that you use provide different results depending on what kind of techniques you're using, whether they're appropriate, and how you're applying the statistics. It's a probabilistic issue, matching two sources. So I was able to get some data, I'll show you, but I don't have the statistical expertise or the source information to interpret them. And so I've been relying on a collaborator to help me perform an analysis. If you don't have all of the possible source data, which probably we never really do, there are flaws in what you're doing, okay? And so that goes back to sort of how this is a process of getting closer and closer to the right answer, because over time, we're going to build up those geodatabases, those potential source databases, and get closer to a real answer. Okay. Native Americans used native copper. They did not have extractive metallurgy. They weren't smelting artifacts, melting down metals, and casting them. We have no evidence for fancy kilns of the sort that you would find. What's that? We have no evidence of fancy kilns that you would find, say, in the old world. So what they were doing was utilizing native copper, which is an uncombined natural mineral form of elemental copper, so essentially pure ore. And what you see here on the right is a photograph from Isle Royale National Park, which is an island in the upper part of Michigan. And there's lots of natural copper that crop out in these veins in this volcanic landscape that people were exploiting. There are quarries that go back thousands of years in this part of the world. Why should we care about copper? One, it's very scarce. So the distribution of usable copper is limited. This created value in prehistoric economics, and it's good for us because these exotic minerals are materials that are on sort of spots on the landscape that are limited. They're easier to source. And so we can get at ancient exchange networks, and that's really what we want to do here. That's what we're trying to get excited about. This is why you see, in terms of provenance work, what people are sourcing, what people aren't sourcing is they're only sourcing things that are rare and have unique chemistry, like obsidians, like copper. And the other cool thing is it gets us, we're able to look at the life history of artifacts in ancient economics. And this is sort of useful in terms of thinking about how people move things around the landscape. And, you know, chimps move rocks a few meters. And through time, you see this thing really taking off. That's one of the characteristic things about human beings is we move materials around to places where they shouldn't be on the landscape. And so plugging in, you know, what we can do, I mean, now it's, you know, we're bringing rocks back from Mars, all right? So understanding sort of the evolution of how people have transported things on the landscape and then putting them within some kind of social context in time, it can add a lot of sort of interesting dimensions to what we know about people in the past. It's shiny, okay? So it's pleasing to look at, and it's used extensively in ornamentation. And so accumulation of this resource and control of it might relate to social status. The other important thing is, for some cultures, it's sacred, particularly the Algonquin speaker
groups that lived around the Great Lakes area. They believed that it was linked to underwater spirits like Pisu, who was the underwater panther. And they suggested that this guy had a copper tail and copper scales, and then the great serpent or horned snake, your copperhead, right? Copperheads don't actually overlap apparently with the Michigan area, but they believed that when they would find nuggets of copper, it was sort of akin to basically being able to take the power of one of these spirit beings and, you know, use it in various ways. Now, we don't know whether or not that kind of cosmology extended to groups all the way down here in the Gulf Coast, but certainly they had their own unique ideas about what copper was about. Copper working goes back over 7,000 years, which I didn't realize when I started working on this. Basically, as soon as people were able to get into the Lake Superior Basin after the glaciers retreated, and they were able to get access to these massive deposits. These are the largest near-surface native copper deposits in the world. So they are right there for the picking. And as soon as people had access to them, they were working them. And late Paleo, okay, they're making late Paleo style lancelets that are almost identical out of copper. The other neat thing about what we know about the earliest copper is because copper oxidation preserves perishables, generally speaking, fairly well. You know, there are examples of bags, textiles that have been preserved through copper contact. Oftentimes, the socketed spear forms that you have in the archaic, they'll preserve a little bit of wood inside the socket that we can date directly. So the oldest definitively dated copper artifact is almost 7,000 cal BP. After the Middle Archaic, after about 5,000 BP, copper becomes extremely common. So how were they working this copper without smelting? Basically, they were going and picking up nuggets. And you can find float copper, not just primary deposits of copper, but float copper that was actually carried by the glaciers and deposited all around the lower margin of the Midwest. So it's quite widely distributed. Take a nugget, pound it flat, grind it. Pretty simple. Pretty much, you know, they didn't have to invent new technology here. They were basically using the same kinds of techniques that they were already familiar with, pecking things, grinding things. Right here is, that's what the process is called annealing, which, you know, when you pound a piece of copper, you make it hard, but then eventually it becomes brittle because the crystals get squished, and then you'll actually make the thing brittle where it's likely to break. And annealing, just sticking it in the fire like that, will actually let those crystals relax a little bit, and then you can work it a little bit more. So that was pretty much the extent of what they were doing. And, you know, hey, they were doing this with rocks too. They were heat treating their rocks, right? Why not heat treat your copper? Now he's putting an edge on it. And there you go. So later on in time, of course, there was some specialization that was developed with copper working. But this archaic stuff, this middle archaic age stuff, it's pretty basic. They were making a variety of really interesting artifact types. All right. So here's a timeline of copper consumption. As soon as they were able to get to the Great Lakes, they were on it. Spear tips, there's a band. Most of the stuff and from there, the concept of it, it's really based on mortuary traditions in the area around the Great Lakes. So there's still a lot that we don't know about that culture. But what we do know is they were getting into copper, who eventually came to want their own copper. Folks in the we started potentially going after and they said, what's it about? Of course, in this, so we actually had probably making copper. Sorry, Bob. By the Hopewellian period or Mississippian period, and so for us in Texas, a lot of the copper that we find is early Caddo copper, which would fall into that Mississippian copper tradition. A lot of the copper in the Mississippian tradition is foils, so they were actually able to pound out these sheets of copper foil that's like less than a millimeter thick, very standardized, and then actually rivet pieces of copper together to make these really elaborate kind of sculptures out of a lot of that flat copper stock. Finally, the other thing that we have in terms of copper working in North America is Mexican copper that's being traded into the Southwest from Mexico. We find lots of these little bells. And I didn't know anything about this. I know relatively little about Mesoamerica, but very close to El Paso, there are quite a few of these copper bell finds. And Casas Grandes, or Paquime, was once thought to have been the center of either copper working and copper making, or at least a distribution center for the Southwest for copper artifacts. And so the story of copper in Mexico is that it was diffused from the Incas around, well, actually probably a little before 600 AD. They were smelting it, right? They weren't making new copper. They were getting casting them using a lost wax technique. And then around AD 1000, 1500 AD, these things started appearing in Hohokam settlements and other settlements in the Southwest. I am not aware of any Mexican copper bells ever being found in Texas, but there's a lot about copper artifacts in Texas that I believe is undocumented, either because they're not like they're in private collections, or people just aren't making much of a deal of them when they're found. The other interesting thing about Mexican copper, of course, is Cabeza de Vaca's journey was affected by copper. I don't know if you guys heard the story about how Cabeza de Vaca was wandering down towards, trying to get back to Mexico City after he'd been shipwrecked in the Galveston area. And once he got past the Rio Grande, he encountered some indigenous folks who had copper bells. They had some of these copper bells, and he thought, "Hey, where did you get that?" And they said, "Oh, well, it's up that way to the north." And he thought to himself, well, if it's cast copper, that must mean civilization. So he actually went up away from Mexico City and added countless days to his journey to get back to civilization because of copper. Fun little story. All right. So copper is pretty common throughout the eastern woodland regions, all the way down to the Gulf Coast. But you don't really hear about much copper in Texas. Is there copper in Texas? How much of it is there? And this map is a little bit difficult to see, but I tried to do a fairly comprehensive survey of where copper is in Texas. And as you can see, it clusters along the coast and in the northeastern corner, which is, of course, the Caddo region. Tim Pergola and Gerard did a study on just sort of a review of where copper occurs within the Caddo region, and they found 18 different sites that had copper. Almost all of these are in graves,
And most of it is early Caddo age, so between 1000 and 1200 AD. And out of all of the copper that I was able to locate, I would say 90% plus of all known copper in Texas is from these Caddo contexts. So it's most likely all of this is relating to the Mississippian exchange networks that were sort of grounded in Cahokia. But we have this interesting cluster in our neck of the woods where we have a few copper pieces, and then this weird thing in central Texas that I didn't believe when I first heard about it. So I think Texas is interesting from the perspective of copper because you have this kind of interesting tornado of copper. Copper's coming down from the northeast, it's coming up from Mexico. Where is the copper coming from? So, you have archaic, early woodland copper potentially traveling down the Mississippi. You have Caddo copper probably coming from the Arkansas River, lower Mississippi River area a little bit later in time. And then even later, you've got cast bells coming up from Mexico, and maybe they're coming up along the coast. Maybe. All right. So talking about our sample, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sites. This one here, the Peggy Lake plate. I made a little replica of it here. This is it's like the only figurative art that I know of that's prehistoric age in Southeast Texas. I mean, there are lots of artifacts that have geometric designs on them, but none of them that actually have a figure of any sort. And folks have speculated that this is some kind of bird man. You can see the talons. This was found at San Jacinto Battleground. When Moore Archaeological Consulting was doing a survey of the surrender site, they were metal detecting for battle-related artifacts, and they found this copper artifact there. Well, the Battle of San Jacinto took place in a location that I like to think of like of Houston's version of Manhattan, right? You have the San Jacinto River coming in there, you have Cedar Bayou coming in there, intersecting with Galveston Bay. There's a lot of shell middens in that landscape, and a bunch of work was done in the early 90s by CRM firms on a lot of those shell midden sites. And so there are quite a few sort of early ceramic age sites that are known in the area. This artifact was buried about 6 inches down. It was very shallow, so the context isn't particularly good. As soon as I saw this thing, I wanted to know where it came from. And we've taken this around to conferences, the Southeast Archaeology Conference, met other archaeologists that find things like this throughout the Southeast. And it's quite similar to what folks have found elsewhere, not in terms of the art, but the shape, the form of it. It's very similar to sort of these headdress elements that you see in Hopewellian early woodland contexts. So the idea is, somebody, imagine I had a long hair and like a bun, it's probably something like that we're seeing. Okay, other copper items, these neat little copper beads from Alabonson Road, that's on White Oak Bayou, North Houston. Texas A&M had that in their collections. They did some excavation there in the mid-90s. The Bowser site, which Houston Archaeological Society excavated, has this really nice, very large awl that was associated with one of the graves there. This thing, which I think came from San Patricio County. This was something that Linda Gorski had because Marshall Black from HAS way back when had this little collection, and there was a copper item in there. And it actually says, the writing on here actually says 41
MB SP10. So like Marshall Black SP10, I don't know. I wasn't able to find any records on this site in the site files at TARL. So we really don't know a lot about what that thing is. But I was trying to get copper to zap with the laser, so I included that in the sample. The other thing that we want to consider is this creek cabin piece, which is just like a little flat plate with a notch in one end. And Von Hamilton has been doing some excavations, I believe, on his property in Burnett County, and he found this thing recently. And when I first saw it, I said, absolutely not, no way, mainly because it didn't fit the pattern of where you find copper in Texas. All of our other sites are either on the coast or in the Northeast. This thing was like north of Boston, you know, it didn't make any sense to me, but that's where he found it. And it appears to come from a ridiculously old context. I'm not convinced. He found it associated with basically Middle Archaic tool types. You know, Middle Archaic projectile points is probably in a midden. He has a bone date on a bone that was associated with it. It's way too old. The implication would be if this thing is as old as the associated materials are, the implication would be that you know, old copper cultures from the Michigan area were trading stuff down into Texas a real long time ago. So that's an interesting one. The other one, there were two artifacts that came from this Savoy site that was part of the Andy Kyle collection, and I got these from Dub Crook. And this was 2021, before Dub's scandal. And, you know, so I eventually cut those out of the analysis for a couple of reasons, and I'll talk about them. Chemically, they were weird. All right, so that's wrong, August 2001. August 2021, I went to the Field Museum, you know, vacation for science, right? And worked with Dr. Laurie Dusabo, who's in charge of the Elemental Analysis Facility, or the Archaeometry Lab at the Chicago Field Museum. They have a bunch of NSF grants that allow them to do different types of chemical analyses relatively cheap for various purposes, for research purposes. And then I got connected with Dr. Mark Hill at Ball State University. You know, Mark, he did his dissertation basically on sourcing copper. Like, he probably has more articles about sourcing copper than anybody currently. So I wanted him to basically help me interpret the data that we were generating. And then after I visited the Field Museum, I found out that Von Hamilton had found that other piece of copper, and he had sent it over to Gregory Latanzi, who did sort of a preliminary analysis. Now we have that data, we're going to integrate it into the overall project. All right, so I went to Chicago, and was during COVID, so it got delayed quite a long time, but I actually got to use the instrument, which was a lot of fun. LAICP-MS stands for Laser Ablation Inductively Coupled Plasma Mass Spectrometry. And basically what that is you stick your samples in this little tray along with your standards. You stick them into the laser ablator, which is above my head right there. And there's a little camera in there, so you can kind of line up the laser with the object. You tell it where you want it to shoot, and it will ablate the surface of that laser, remove all of the corrosion and contamination that's on the weathering surface of that material. And then you can actually sample underneath the exterior rind of the artifact. So the chemistry is going to be legit. It's not the chemistry of the outer surface of the artifact that's weathered and different than the interior, right? And so you'll actually ablate a tiny amount, and it's, you know, 500 to 400 microns. It's like a pinhead. It's very, very small. And so this is often called a semi-destructive method. There are lots of euphemisms for it. It's destructive, but you usually can't tell that it even happened. The only way that I could tell that those artifacts had been lasered was there was like a tiny bit of soot where the laser had hit, and you can just wipe that off with a Kleenex and never find that spot again. Very small. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One is it's back to a non-renewable resource, and for folks that consider some of them tend to be very good, having that minimal impact. The other cool thing about this is you have to pre-prepare the samples. Normally when you're doing ICP-MS, you have to grind up the sample, you have to digest it in acid, put it into solution to inject it into the machine. With this system, you don't have to do that. So it saves you a lot of time. It's nice. Rice University has one. I've never been able to get permission to use it. It's very, very sensitive, very fast, inexpensive. And so essentially what happens is you ablate some of the copper. It gets sucked up by this little vacuum, combined with argon gas. That travels over into the mass spectrometer. This little green thing here is where it gets transformed into a plasma. So the inductive coupled part of the inductively coupled plasma, it's like a little electric gizmo inside that thing that heats it up to like the temperature of the sun. and then it goes through the mass spectrometer. So it's a really nifty machine. And so here are our results in terms of bulk and trace elements. And you can see here, they are very, very pure coppers, almost 99.8%, most of these. So we can be relatively well assured that they are in fact native coppers. This guy on the far right, the one from, that should be SP, not SB10, San Patricio County, you can see it's got a lot of other stuff in it. So it's still almost 99% copper, but there's a lot of other elements in there, one of which is bismuth. It's quite a bit of bismuth. This is the stuff that came from the Savoy site. And we ran those a couple of times because they were giving us like kind of silly amounts of iron. You can see one of them is it's less than 97% copper, and then there's like a ton of iron in it. And we couldn't really figure out what was going on there. I don't know if, these were fake or what, or where they came from, but these were the ones that we excluded from the analysis since they just weren't playing right. And when we actually tried to source them, they were giving us weird answers, so forget about that. All right, so preliminary results. This is what Dr. Gregory Lattanzi came up with for the Creek Cabin plate. And keep in mind that Lattanzi, he's in New Jersey, he has very different source data than Mark Hill. And so he did very different types of source data. This is probably going to change, but essentially he was getting hits on Lake Superior stuff, maritime stuff from further up in the Northeast for this one. So definitely not Texas, definitely not the Southern Appalachian area for that particular artifact. The Bowser Owl, we had about, so these P numbers are basically the probabilities, right? So it's about 56% probability of coming from Isle Royale in Michigan, and Snake River, it's about 43% chance. Those aren't particularly high, but those were the closest that the copper data clustered with. And Snake River, so Isle Royale is a primary deposit. Snake River is a secondary deposit of glacial till.
The Peggy Lake stuff, almost 90% probability that it came from the Snake River sources, and then a tiny probability that it came from the Southern Appalachian area. If it came, given that it probably is Hopewellian, it wouldn't be that big of a surprise that it could have come from the Southern Appalachians, because during the Hopewellian and Mississippian times, what we see when we try to source copper from those ages is they weren't as often coming from the Upper Peninsula. They were actually starting to branch out and exploit copper resources in the Appalachian areas. The Alabonson Road stuff, very, very, very high probability that it came from Isle Royale. I love it. And the radiocarbon date that we got on that site is 600 AD. There's ceramics there. It's early ceramic age. Yeah, our beads in Houston came from 1,000 miles away, more than 1,000 miles away, in Isle Royale. That's pretty good. This thing is weird. So it says Champion Mine probability 88%, but when Mark did the statistics, there was this huge Mahalanobis Nobis distance, so it was unreliable. There was a lot of arsenic and bismuth, and these are the types of things that get introduced into alloys that are being smelted, probably in higher percentages than what we have here. One thing to note is there is no tin, and some of the early copper work that was alloyed, it generally has tin worked in there too, and tin was not detectable, and it doesn't appear to be cast. So we really don't know what the situation is with this thing that presumably came from around Corpus Christi. The interesting thing is, if you do some digging, there are these old collections that have bits of copper in them. It isn't mentioned anywhere in this book, but there are plates where there was obviously copper next to late prehistoric artifacts. And one, in fact, that looks just like the one that we tested. And this is on Eagleside, Copano Bay, just north of Rockport, where there's a lot of late prehistoric archaeology. I'd like to do more testing. I'd like to try to track down some of these artifacts. Okay, so preliminary conclusions. Most tested copper came from the Lake Superior region, which is very far away. Not a surprise, but now we actually have some real data to support it. And there's this lingering question about whether or not we have Mexican copper in prehistoric contexts. Ancient copper in Texas is more than meets the eye. Provenance studied provide fingerprints that can be matched to potential sources, but of course, none of this is straightforward. Nothing is ever sourced beyond a doubt. More work is needed. Testing is really easy using laser ablation. It's not very expensive either, but there are challenges such as what the heck does this mean? And the fact that grave goods dominate make it a little difficult to come up with an excuse to zap these things. The fact that it's minimally invasive helps, but oftentimes we're not able to do the kinds of science that we want to do because there are ethical considerations. So here are my main references, and that's it.
There's like more, there's something that's not far, that's more the like central Rocky Mountain. What about copper sources from more like the central or southern south area? And are those people that are doing this sources information from signatures from the
That's, yeah. So Allison asked, basically, are people looking at sources in Mexico using the same types of techniques, the same lines of inquiry? And that's a really good question, because the answer is no. Because all of the copper that's coming from Mexico is a different type of metallurgy, so a different set of inquiries and instruments are being applied to figure out where those coppers are coming from. Most often, when you read about people trying to source Mexican copper, they're using lead isotope ratios to source that copper, because lead is something that's very commonly introduced during the smelting process, and it's very location specific. So it's different. Now, if somebody was very determined to build up a database that would make it comparable to the work that's being done on native copper, it might be possible. I'm not aware of native copper deposits in Mexico that would have been usable. So I don't fully know how to answer your question, but it's complicated basically. But yeah, there's a disjunct between the kinds of research that are happening on copper in the Eastern Woodlands region versus Mesoamerica. They don't talk to each other. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we can't rule anything out. Basically, the result that we got indicates that we probably just don't know. We just don't have a source. We don't have the right kinds of sources to compare it against. It still was relatively pure copper. And that's part of the problem, is I haven't seen enough smelted copper to know it when I saw it. And the other folks that are working on native copper artifacts in the Eastern Woodland regions haven't seen enough of it to know it when they've seen it either. So it's a disciplinary divide that needs to be, we need to talk to other people to try to figure out what's happening here in Texas, because we're kind of like, we're right at the margins of where all these interesting things are happening. Mm-hmm. Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, this thing. Yeah. I mean, and when they found it, they thought it was historic. They thought it was related to the battleground. Right. And it was only after they cleaned it and saw like the weird Birdman on it that they were like, okay, this is. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think I was talking to somebody in the audience earlier. We need to start using metal detectors at prehistoric sites, because I think this stuff is a lot more prominent than we would think, and we're just not capturing it when we do our research. Those beads, for instance, at Alabonson Road, are so small they would have fallen through a 1/4-inch mesh. They just happen to find them in situ. So it's worth raising awareness that these things can be found outside of burials. And when they are, they're all the more valuable because it's easier for us to prevail upon descendant communities to let us sap them.
And then
I've never heard it. I can tell you.
And then, finally, wants to know, also they could talk about which, yeah, I don't know what we're studying. He said, but questions on it might have been created Western Florida.
Huh. No, I wasn't aware of that. And so, I mean, one of the things that I tried doing was reaching out to Hester. So I've talked to him about this project because I know he interacts a lot with the collector community. And I figured, well, Hester might know of somebody that has some copper in a private collection. And he said he had no idea. And, you know, I mean, I'm not giving up. I think that there's plenty of copper out there, but Tom couldn't think of anything off the top of his head that he knew. Hey, you should go zap that. I don't know if I haven't heard of that one. I don't know if that's new or what. I should probably talk to Hester again. So yeah.
Can I speak? Can I speak?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, Hester gave a talk on this copper gorget at the South Texas Archaeological Association yearly meeting. And he thought it was similar to the type that were traded by the Spanish in Florida, the Indians in Florida. So he thought it basically traveled by Indian trade to Texas. It's a private collector found it, but he has a lot of faith in this particular person.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, we're almost running out of time. Thank you very much, guys. That was very, very enjoyable. Thanks for coming. Everybody have a pleasant evening. Thank you.